Today is 7th July 2024, and we're now several days away from the parliamentary elections in Britain. And I think the message of that election is still in the process of being digested by the British political class, some of whom I've noticed continue to be in denial. One of the indicators of this is that I've read several articles now which increase the size of the Labour vote, not so much in absolute terms, in terms of absolute numbers, but in terms of percentages. So I've just read, for example, one article in the Daily Telegraph, which claims that the Labour Party gained 36% of the vote in the general election that has just happened, whereas the true figure is 33.7%. And there's been other articles, and I've read several now, which continue to claim, quite falsely, that Keir Starmer's Labour Party on Thursday won more votes than Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party did in the 2019 election. I've seen numbers claiming, articles claiming that Starmer on Thursday gained 700,000 more votes than Corbyn in 2019. Another article that said that he won 900,000 more votes than Corbyn in 2019, whereas in fact there is no doubt whatsoever that he won fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn did in 2019. And the more one unpacks the figures, the more one drills just below the surface, one sees how unstable in some ways the Labour majority actually is. One of the things I had not fully appreciated, for example, is the extent to which Reform UK is now running the Labour Party second in many of the so-called red wall seats in the north of England and in the Midlands. In my opinion, had the election continued for another week, we would have started to see Reform UK started to win seats from the Labour Party or win contests against the Labour Party in some of these constituencies. For Keir Starmer and for his party, the election, the actual election on the 4th of July, came only just in time. Just saying. And I think that the same, by the way, is true of other places where Keir Starmer and his Labour Party were running against various left-wing independents. So it turns out that in a constituency in Birmingham, the New Workers' Party, led by George Galloway, which has only just been founded and has been struggling to get itself organised in advance of this election. The election was called just a few weeks after this party appeared, so that it has no organisation across Britain in the way that all the other parties do. Anyway, in Birmingham, one of the candidates of the Workers' Party just failed to defeat the sitting Labour MP by a few hundred votes. In other places, the sitting Labour MP just about held on in the face of other challenges from other independents. This happened, for example, to the Education Minister, as he's now, the new Health Minister, as he's going to be, Wes Streeting. He just held on in the face of a challenge from an independent in his constituency in North London, Ilford North. And in Bristol, one of the most left-wing cities in Britain, just saying, the Labour Party, lost one seat to the Greens, and is quite plausibly going to face significant challenges to hold on to other seats in Bristol in the face of further challenges from the Greens. it looks to me as if, quite plausibly, in a future election, we could see Starmer's Labour Party facing a double challenge from Reform UK in some of the working class constituencies that used to form the old Labour Party's heartland in the sort of old coal mining and iron and steel and industrial towns and cities in central and northern England, whereas in the cities, the places where young professionals and students are concentrated, the Starmerist Labour Party could potentially face future challenges there from other political groups, more amorphous perhaps, but located to the left of it. Anyway, it's an unstable picture, a deeply unstable picture. And again, I've noticed a certain unwillingness on the part of the political class to grapple with the reality of the extent to which British voters simply refuse to participate in huge numbers in this election, so that turnout was just over 59%, was between 59 and 60%, which I'm told is the second worst turnout in a British election since the 1880s. I've seen, for example, some claims that the result for the Conservative Party is not quite as bad as it seemed it might be. The Conservative Party managed to win 23% of the vote. 23% is already a catastrophic collapse. Consider that in 2019, Boris Johnson's Conservative Party won just under 44% of the vote, which is a similar proportion of the vote, though slightly greater than Theresa May had also won in 2017. Well, 23% is an enormous collapse from that position. But just remember also that the 23% that the Conservatives won is 23% of the 59.8 or 9% of the British electorate who actually voted. If you unscramble the figures, then the proportion of the British electorate, the total British electorate, those who voted and those who didn't, that voted Conservative in this last election falls to, I believe, somewhere around 17, 18% of the electorate in total, which is a catastrophic collapse. And I want to reiterate again, we are looking here at what is indisputably, as far as I'm concerned, for the Conservative Party, an existential moment. Anyway, that's just to round out on what is happening with the results in Britain. There's lots of talk, lots of advice being given by all sorts of people on the, what I would call the neoliberal side of things, to Keir Starmer, to seize the moment, to capitalise on his big majority, to drive events forward, to reshape Britain in the way that this opportunity supposedly gives him. Every single prescription that these people who are giving Starmer this advice will, I think, antagonise and infuriate the British people even further. It's advice to do more of the same, still more of the same, only in an even more extreme way. And I think it will not go down well at all. And as for Tony Blair, who of course cannot fail in this situation to present himself again to the British people without, I think, understanding the degree to which he is an absolutely unacceptable, deeply unpopular figure now with large sections of the British electorate. Anyway, he wrote a massive article in the London Times giving his advice to Keir Starmer, which I tried to plough through, looking to see what advice it was, what new programme it was that Blair was going to advise Keir Starmer to follow. And I noticed that it was all about introducing AI to an even greater extent than before, and basically, as far as I could see, going for digital ID cards, that kind of thing, which, coming from Blair, really doesn't surprise me. Anyway, the British election is only one of the elections that has been taking place in the West at the present time. We have also had, and we're also in the middle today of an election in France, an election which in some respects will be, I think, or could be, even more consequential than the election we've just seen in Britain. France, still more than Britain, tends to make the political weather. And if the Rassemblement National breaks through, if it establishes itself as the majority party in the French National Assembly, which I must say, as of this moment, is looking unlikely, but cannot be completely excluded, I suppose. Anyway, if that happens, that is a political earthquake which will reverberate across Europe. And, well, even if it doesn't happen, the Rassemblement National looks certain to be the biggest party in the French National Assembly, or at least all the indications suggest that it will be. And that also will already be an important fact in French politics going forward. That's not to say that the political establishment in France isn't pulling out every stop to try to push the genie of the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's party, back into the bottle. I've just been reading in The Guardian a long letter written by various French historians urging the French people to vote against the Rassemblement National. They go through all sorts of various reasons why they think that a vote for Rassemblement National would be a bad thing. One can take issue with some of what they say. Perhaps one can agree with some of what they say. But I noticed that tacked on at the end is what I suspect for many of them and for many sections of the political class, not just in France, but across Europe, the single most important thing was there, tacked on at the end, which is that the Rassemblement National is supposedly too soft on Vladimir Putin and on Russia, and isn't sufficiently supportive of Ukraine. I really do believe that for many of these people, that is actually far and away the single biggest and most important issue. Anyway, just saying. So we will have to wait and see what the results are going to be in the French election, the second round. In France, results tend to come out fairly fast. There is a high chance that by the time you're watching this video, you will know the results already. I am making this video several hours before the polling stations in France close, so I do not know what the results are going to be. Even if you do, I will have to comment on the results, which I will do in detail on Monday when I know what they are. Anyway, that's France. The other crisis, the one that is perhaps the single most important of all, is the one, however, in the United States, where it's absolutely clear to me that President Biden is now determined to hold his ground and seems to be determined to see off all potential challenges and has shown that he has no intention of standing down either as candidate for the Democratic Party going forward into the November election or indeed as President of the United States. This despite the fact that my sense is that the unease, that the worry within the Democratic Party, within the Democratic Party aligned media and amongst the donor community is now growing by leaps and bounds. They are becoming increasingly concerned that Biden is not the person who can lead the Democratic Party to anything remotely like a victory in the election in November. And my guess, as I said already, is that what's driving these concerns is private polling data that is now pouring into the DNC from all the various private pollsters that it consults, all of which I suspect show a collapse of support for the president, especially in the battleground states and in other places. And for the record, I think that the president's comeback, the various speeches that he's given, the interview that he has given, they've all been extremely unconvincing in persuading anybody that the performance that the president exhibited in the debate with Donald Trump was somehow an exception to the rule. On the contrary, the president's behavior, his words, his entire approach, I think is tending increasingly to reinforce the doubts that exist about him. But he refuses to go. He insists that he will remain in post. And I get the sense also that there is a group of people around him who are also determined that he remain in place. And he does have, it must be said, a strong basis for insisting that he should not only remain president, but that he should also be the party's candidate in the November election. Briefly, he has 90% of the votes from the primaries. Alex Christoforou and I discussed on the Duran months and months ago, before the primaries, how important it was for the Democrats to resolve the problems generated by the president's obvious inabilities, to try to resolve them before the primaries. But of course the Democrats didn't. So the result is that the president went through the primaries, to all intents and purposes, unopposed, so that all of the delegates to the convention elected via the primaries are, in theory at least, committed to him. So the same is true for all the money that has been contributed to his campaign, allegedly around $100 million. Some of it, perhaps all of it, could perhaps be transferred to Kamala Harris, were she to be the candidate. She is, after all, the candidate for the vice presidency. But, of course, for that to happen, the president must stand down. I get the sense that there is no great appetite in the United States to remove the president using the 25th Amendment. I think there would have to be a significant amount of medical supporting evidence to justify the exercise of the 25th Amendment. And to be frank, I doubt that there is. And, well, some people are now floating what I suspect are far-fetched ideas. There's a fascinating article by Stephen B. Young in Real Clear Politics. Stephen B. Young is a lawyer who is assistant dean at the Harvard Law School and later dean and professor of law at the Hamline University School of Law. So he's somebody who clearly has, a significantly deeper knowledge of these kind of things and of US constitutional law than I do. Anyway, he's argued 2 points. He's made 2 points. Firstly, if the president were to stand down as a candidate, then logically he should also stand down as president as well. He puts it in this way: should Biden attempt to have his cake and eat it too, he might withdraw his candidacy for this year's presidential election, but not resign as president. If he affirms that he would not be qualified to execute the office of president in January 2025, then why is he qualified to serve in that office today? To withdraw from the presidential race but continue in office would be a violation of his duty of loyalty to the American people. With that view, I fully agree. But Stephen B. Young goes a lot further than that. He says that if the president decides to cling on, if he refuses to either to resign as a candidate and also to resign as president, then he is already failing in the duty of his office, and Congress has grounds to impeach him. And Mr. Young points out that he was one of the researchers at the time of Richard Nixon's impeachment, and that his deep research into English practice, the English practice of impeachment, makes him an authority on the topic, and that some of the fruits of his research were incorporated into the articles of impeachment that were drawn up against Richard Nixon. I have to say that though the legal argument, or at least I'm not sure whether impeachment is a legal case, but anyway, the argument at a legal level, a theoretical level, might be attractive, I think it is all but inconceivable that a Senate with a Democratic majority would impeach the president. I just don't believe it is going to happen, particularly on this ground. And I would add that if it did, it would be an absolute political catastrophe for the Democratic Party. The Senate impeaching the Senate with a Democratic majority impeaching a Democratic president. And because it would be such a huge political catastrophe, I just don't believe it's going to happen. But anyway, it's an interesting argument, and the fact that it's being made at all shows how intractable and difficult this situation has now become. Now, I'm going to make a further point. If there is no simple way of leveraging the president out of office or out of his determination to remain the party's candidate, then the Democratic Party could very well find that it has no realistic choice but to bite its tongue and retain him as their candidate and go through the motions, at least, of supporting him. Because however bad the prospect of doing that might look to some members of the party, a prolonged argument over this issue, a major conflict between the president and his own party in advance of the presidential election, the effect of that is going to be even worse. Before long, we're going to be into the convention period. Donald Trump is going to be triumphantly elected the party's candidate at the Republican Party's convention. He's going to come across as fully in control of the Republican Party, as a commanding and strong candidate, more commanding and more strong perhaps than some people like, but there it is. Whereas the Democratic Party if they allow this issue to continue for much longer, are going to look a complete and hopeless mess and a jumble, a ragbag of arguing, feuding factions in which nobody is happy with the situation, but no one can find a solution to it. And even in a country as politically polarized as the United States has become, I cannot imagine that that is a good way for a party like the Democratic Party to go into an election. So if they cannot remove the president within the next 2 weeks, and I think it's about 2 weeks is all that's left, if they can't remove the president in the next 2 weeks, in my opinion, they have no realistic choice but to unite behind him, however unhappy with that prospect they are. Alternatively, of course, they can find some way to get rid of him. But how that will be done, I simply don't know. I'm sure all sorts of reasons can be provided to the president, and all sorts of particularly compelling reasons could be made, which have little to do with his health and might have things to do with his various legal problems and those of members of his family. I'm being very careful about what I say now, but I know that kind of thing has been done before. Perhaps that's the way they'll get round this problem. But whatever it is that they're going to do, they need to do it quickly. They cannot allow this situation to continue to fester for much longer. The longer it continues, the worse for them it becomes. Anyway, a British election which demonstrates how hollow the political system in Britain has become, and how hollowed out is the reputation and authority in Britain of the political class. A situation in France where, as far as the political class is concerned, the enemy is now at the gates and might quite plausibly break through in what is increasingly starting to look like a pre-revolutionary crisis. And a situation in the United States, the most important country of all, where everything is now in abeyance, everything is now in chaos, because the political class basically gaslit the American people, pretending to them that they had an effective and strong chief executive, whereas in fact, as is now all too clear, that was not the case. Anyway, there we are. That's where we are as of today. The next, as I said, big result will be the one tonight in France. I'll be discussing that both with Alex Christoforou and on my own behalf tomorrow. Anyway, let's move on. Much more to discuss about the situation going on around the world. And let's turn principally now to that perennial issue, the topic of Ukraine. Now, Viktor Orban, who has just been to Moscow and met with Putin, has given some very interesting interviews following his meeting with Putin. He has said that Putin is a cold, rational person, that it requires a politician, statesman to deal with someone like that, but that Putin is in no sense somebody who is beyond reason and argument. The attempt to discuss things with him absolutely must be made. And on that, by the way, I fully agree with Orban. I don't myself think that there is any real prospect of negotiations taking place. And, well, Simplicius the Thinker has written a long piece today about the Russian view of negotiations. And he takes the view that basically Putin is not interested in negotiations. He's staking out Russian positions because he's under constant pressure. He's been constantly badgered to do so. But that privately, Putin feels that the only outcome to this war is going to be a military one, that the military campaign, the special military operation, must be fought to its conclusion. When Putin comes up with various proposals, he makes them, he sets them out in the knowledge that the Western powers and the Ukrainians are bound to reject them. And, well, that's all there is to it. Putin has no real belief in negotiations as a way to end this conflict. I think there is some truth to this, but I think actually Putin's stance is rather more complicated than Simplicus the Thinker allows. I think that Putin at various times, as he has repeatedly said, has made a serious effort to negotiate a satisfactory resolution to the Ukrainian crisis. Satisfactory, which that is to say from a Russian point of view. He's made, as he would see, numerous concessions to try to make that possible in the past. He has invariably found that the Ukrainians and the Western powers pocket the concessions that he has made and never come back on what they promise. They never deliver on what they promise. So that every time that the Russians make concessions, they find that at the end they're in a weaker position. And Putin clearly does not want to be put in that position again. At the same time, I think that if he could be confident that a negotiated outcome could be achieved, one which answers to Russia's key security concerns, keeping Ukraine out of NATO, ensuring that the four regions are indeed incorporated in Russia, providing for complete Ukrainian disarmament and neutrality. I think if Putin could be convinced that this really was going to happen as a result of actual good faith negotiations, I think we would probably find that in making his proposals, he's actually being quite sincere. To my mind, Putin's approach to this conflict is very much that of a lawyer, and it closely resembles the approach taken by another lawyer politician, President Lincoln, during the Civil War, in which President Lincoln led the United States in the 1860s. Both Lincoln and Putin repeatedly make reasonable proposals to the other side, which clearly are intended to resolve the conflict. I've no doubt that, just as in Lincoln's case, Putin's proposals are sincere and made in good faith. I also believe that in Lincoln's case, Lincoln always pitched his proposals, perhaps intentionally, as lawyers sometimes do, at a level where, despite their undoubted sincerity and reasonableness, there was no real prospect that the other side would accept them. And I'm afraid I think the same is true of Putin. He is entirely sincere and acting in complete good faith in the proposals that he is making. But at the same time, he knows that the other side won't accept the proposals, and for that reason, he's prepared to keep going, and like Lincoln, he's going to keep going until he achieves final victory. And just as was the case with Lincoln, so it is the case with Putin, that what both of these statesmen wanted and want is not just a political and military victory, but also in some sense a moral one. A victory which, when it is achieved, will enable them to say that, well, they didn't desire the war, which in both cases was true, that they made every effort within reason to bring the war to an end, which was also true, that they made concession after concession and were extremely reasonable to the other side, which again, in both cases is true, so that when the war ends with complete victory, in both cases, the other side has nowhere basically to retreat to. They have no argument left to make that they were somehow defeated in a way that positioned them against some kind of implacable opponent who was determined to destroy them right from the outset. And that, of course, makes an eventual reconciliation easier, just as the South came eventually to see Lincoln as somebody who was sincere in seeking peace and reconciliation. So perhaps one day, perhaps not immediately, perhaps not tomorrow or next year or in 5 years' time, but eventually the Ukrainians, the people in Ukraine, might also come to a same view about Putin and Russia. Anyway, I think this is what Putin is doing. I think he's looking further and beyond. But let me repeat again, if the Ukrainians, if the Ukrainians, just as was the case with the South, if the Ukrainians took Putin at his words, declared an immediate ceasefire, announced a complete pullback of their forces from the four regions, agreed to keep Ukraine out of NATO and to make it a neutral country again, as it promised that it would be at the time when it gained independence from the Soviet Union. Then I think Putin would probably agree to make peace, just as the southern states, if they had accepted the kind of proposals that Lincoln was making earlier in the war, could also have made peace with Lincoln and the United States on that basis. Anyway, that's my own view of this. This is what I think is happening. But of course, nothing like this is going to happen. Zelensky is not going to make peace on Putin's terms. There's no indication, by the way, that he wants to make peace on Putin's terms. As I have already discussed, Zelensky knows perfectly well that if he did agree to peace, any sort of peace with Russia, which left the Russians in control of even a millimeter of Ukrainian territory, he would very quickly be out of power. And indeed, if there is peace in Ukraine, he is going to be out of power one way or the other anyway. His entire survival as a political figure, and perhaps his personal prospects of survival as an individual, rest now on a perpetuation of the war. And, well, we've now had words, a warning, quite obviously addressed to him from no less than the Azov Brigade. Now, in recent programs, I spoke about how the Azov Brigade appears to me to be busy, in effect, engaging in the process of narrative construction. They made all kinds of statements and statements. They complained about generals. They complained about the process of mobilization. They've engaged in an insignificant counteroffensive in a forgotten area of the conflict. What they're doing, in effect, is building up a heroic narrative around themselves and their cause. And one of their objectives is not to defeat Russia, which I suspect they probably now realize perfectly well is beyond Ukraine's strength. It is not to achieve victory. It is to maintain, to preserve the integrity of the cause for which they are fighting, and to construct the myth of heroic resistance and betrayal upon which they hope that they will build and future Ukrainian nationalists will build once the war is over and the defeat has taken place. And they're giving, as I said, quite obvious and very straightforward statements of warning directed to President Zelensky. And we have a whole series of statements by Bogdan Krotevich, who is one of the leaders of the Azov Brigade. This is, I believe, the 12th Special Forces Brigade, which is the actual hardcore, reconstituted Azov Brigade. The people who were basically captured in Mariupol and who were then released by the Turks and have now been reconstituted into a new brigade. There is the other Azov Brigade, the third Azov Brigade, the third Assault Brigade. They are busy making TikTok videos about themselves. And there's no reason, by the way, to doubt that they are fully of the same view as their comrades in the 12th Brigade. But anyway, Mr. Krotevich has now issued a statement, a message on X. And, well, he makes comments like this. No peace without victory. Victory means not a single Russian soldier on Ukrainian territory. We will not leave this war to our descendants. You can already see the narrative construction, addressing future generations of Ukrainians. That it's all about the future. We're not fighting for today. We're fighting for tomorrow. We will not leave this war to our descendants. And you, who is you exactly? Pretty obvious who you is. Zelensky and no one else. And you won't either. Because if you try, it will be bad for you and for them. If this is a test, don't even think about it. I wrote about this calmly. And so, if that's not a threat to Zelensky, not to entertain any peace terms at all, to go on fighting, not of course towards victory, which is, as I said, unachievable, but to go on fighting right up to the moment of ultimate and total defeat. Never surrender, never negotiate, never capitulate, just go on fighting to the very end. Well, what is? It's very much like the attitude, by the way, of the German leader in the last months of the Second World War. He too, quite obviously, realized that the war was lost. But realizing that he could not defeat the Allies, he sought another victory of a different sort. A victory over the Germans, the German people, and Germany itself. a victory achieved by keeping them in the war right through to the very bitter end. There would be no negotiations, no capitulation. He did not know, as he famously once said, the meaning of the word capitulation. He would go on fighting to the very last bullet, and well, it didn't quite end like that. There was, in fact, a German surrender, but it came after the fall of Berlin, after most of Germany had been occupied by the Allies. It came in conditions of total defeat. And he undoubtedly believed that he would create a legend on the basis of which future generations of Germans would build and would follow. It didn't turn out like that either. But I think quite obviously this is how the people of the Azov Brigade are thinking. They want to keep fighting. They do not want negotiations. They do not want any type of what they would call surrender or betrayal, because that would affect the integrity of their cause. It might lead to the eventual creation of a Ukraine different from the one that they want to see. So, they want the fighting to continue. They're threatening Zelensky that if he changes course, if he starts to negotiate, they will come after him. They made similar threats in the past, and I think it would be a huge mistake to think that these threats are not seriously intended. Now, of course, it ought to be possible, in theory, for Zelensky or for any Ukrainian government that did decide to negotiate to face these people down. After all, they're only a relatively small force. They only account for a relatively small part of the Ukrainian population. Possibly, if there were negotiations, much of the military would go along with that. But I have to say that I cannot imagine that Zelensky himself has the force or authority or popularity in Ukraine today to initiate negotiations and to hold back the forces of the Azov Brigade. I don't think that he would be able to mobilize the support on the part of the military, the security forces, the wider population that he would need in order to see them off. So I don't think there is going to be a prospect. There are going to be negotiations. I think the Azov Brigade are going to get what they want. They're going to go keep Ukraine in the war, even as defeat grows remorselessly closer. Now, let's turn to what is actually happening on the battlefronts. And I've said already that the situation in Ukraine continues to go from bad to worse for Ukraine. And, well, we are now starting to get more and more indicators of this. Firstly, there have apparently been dramatic events taking place in the fighting in the Kupiansk area. This is south of Kupiansk, leading up to the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. It looks as if the Russians have achieved significant breakthroughs there. They appear to have broken through and perhaps captured a strategic village called Pischane, and they look like they're about to storm and capture a village, or perhaps rather a small town, called Makeevka. Now, I remember Makeevka, it was discussed before. I remember a couple of months ago when there was fighting going on close to a village called Terny on the Zherebets River. There were reports circulating that the Russians at that time had already captured Makeevka. I remember being very, very skeptical about those claims. Anyway, those claims were obviously untrue, but the Russians are indeed now in the process of storming Makeevka. That particular attack is indeed coming, and it looks as if Makeevka is about to fall, and Pischane has already fallen. In other words, it looks as if the entire Ukrainian position along the Zherebets and Oskol River is in the process of collapse, and that the Russians have achieved that outflanking of the Ukrainian defenses north around Kupiansk that they've been aiming for some months. That the major offensive, the major Russian attack, did not happen towards Kupiansk itself, from this village of Sinkovka, just east of Kupiansk. As became increasingly clear, it came in the battles in the south. And of course, well, it was taken as read, I remember, during the fighting in Terny, that if Terny fell, all the other villages that the Ukrainians controlled along the Zherebets River would fall one after the other. If Makeevka falls, Terny will fall, so you'll have that effect. And then, of course, if the Russians gain control of the villages along the Zherebets River, then they can advance across the river towards Liman, which they held for some months during the summer of 2022, but which Ukraine recaptured during the Ukraine's autumn 2022 Kharkiv offensive. And, well, if Liman falls with the Russians now tightening their grip around the other town to the east of Siversk, this is a town in northern Donetsk region, well, the entire Ukrainian defense positions around Slavyansk, the northern spur of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, is going to become increasingly vulnerable, especially if the Russians are in a position to cross the Oskol River, recapture Kupiansk, recapture perhaps Izium and Balakleya, those places they also retreated from in autumn 2022. And, well, the Russians then would be in a position to advance on Slavyansk from two sides, from the north and from the east, and do so from a more secure position than briefly appeared to be the case in 2022. And I would add that the fighting in the north, in Kharkiv region, is related to these events in Kupiansk and along the Oskol and Zherebets river lines. Now, the Russians controlled some of these places that are being fought over in Kharkiv region, places like Volchansk and Lipsy, in the summer of 2022, but they withdrew from them after Ukraine's autumn 2022 Kharkiv offensive. And in the case of Volchansk, it certainly seems to me to make great sense for the Russians to want to recapture Volchansk, because Volchansk, if you look at the main roads, is intimately connected to the Ukrainian defense positions further south in Kupiansk. and Izium and Balakleia. There's been much talk and discussion and debate in the West about how the Russian offensive in Kharkiv region is intended to capture Kharkiv city itself. It seems to me that the Russians have never shown any real desire to capture Kharkiv city, at least not for the present. But in terms of Volchansk, where the fighting in Kharkiv region is most bitter, the capture of Volchansk absolutely does make sense in terms of those battles that the Russians are really interested in, the battles in Donbas, the battles that seek to capture places like Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and win, finally and conclusively, the battle for Donbas, the larger battle for Donbas, complete what is sometimes called the Donbas arc of operations, which, to be clear, is the key conflict which will decide this war. And just as the Russians are now breaking through towards the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, south of Kupiansk, we've had reports over the last 24 hours that they're making significant further progress in Volchansk. There's been reports from Group of Forces North that they have now captured significant areas within the area of the high-rise buildings, the so-called citadel in northern Volchansk. And they also have been steadily expanding and extending the bridgehead around the village of Bugrovata that they have captured east of the Seversky Donetsk river. So, which puts them in a good position to outflank Ukrainian positions in southern Volchansk. So it looks as if the Russians are steadily coming closer to their objective, which is to recapture Volchansk completely. And once they do, as I've said, this will have a significant impact on the fighting around Kupiansk further south. Now, since we're talking about Kharkiv region, the Ukrainians have been making now extremely intense attacks against Russian positions, the positions of Group of Forces North in the Lipsy area, trying apparently again to recapture this small village of Glubovata that the Russians control here to the north of Lipsy. And Group of Forces North, a couple of days ago, was saying that the Ukrainians were now finally attacking in units of 100, that's to say a company at a time. And there's clearly been intense fighting in Glubovata as the Ukrainians try to recapture this village from the Russians. And according to the Group of Forces North, the Ukrainians are suffering very severe losses in these battles. But film and photographic evidence effectively confirms that the Ukrainians have now broken into the village, and though they haven't captured the village as a whole, or even the greater part of it, they do seem to have captured perhaps 2 streets in the village. And the Russians, for their part, are responding by shelling and bombing the Ukrainian troops who have advanced into this village in a relentless way, using their aircraft and artillery and mortars and drones and all of these things. It is very similar to the tactic that was discussed way back in the summer of 2022 by a US Marine officer who wrote under the anonymous name of Marinus in the Journal of the US Marine Corps, in which he said that from time to time the Russians show a willingness to retreat in the face of attack and to draw their adversary into, in effect, a fire pocket where the Russians have already studied and measured the ground in detail, and where the enemy, in this case the Ukrainians, if they enter, will face relentless artillery shelling and bombing and will suffer horrific consequences in consequence, and horrific losses in consequence. And it seems to me that this is exactly what we're seeing in the area of Lipsy. But important to stress again, in Kharkiv region, the fighting in Lipsy is the sideshow. For the Russians, the really important battle is the battle for Volchansk. That is the one that impacts on the larger battle that the Russians are looking to win further south in the Kupiansk area as they prepare for the final battle for Donbas, the battle around Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And, well, there's been less news about what is going on in Siversk, a fortified town controlled by the Ukrainians in northern Donetsk region, which the Russians failed to capture in 2022, but around which the Russian net is closing. But further south still, but connected to these battles, in locations which bring the Russians potentially very close to the southern spur of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, the city of Kramatorsk. There we are getting more news. And it has been reported today that the Russians have now captured some territory in western or south central, or in an area of Chasov Yar, west of the aqueduct. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly where this location, the location, this area is, but they have apparently advanced into Chasov Yar itself, west of the aqueduct, having already captured, of course, the micro-district, where, by the way, they have now raised their flag, confirming their full control of the entire micro-district, which lies east of the aqueduct. And going further south, it's getting very difficult to get a full and clear picture of the fighting in the Toretsk sector, south of Chasov Yar, for only one reason, and that is that the Russians in the Toretsk sector repeatedly turn up, pictures suddenly appear showing Russian soldiers and advancing and fighting with the Ukrainians in locations in the Toretsk sector where no one expects them to be, because they appear to be well to the rear of the positions that all the previous reports had suggested that the Ukrainians were holding their lines. So the Russians seem to be advancing deeper and further in Toretsk than anybody had anticipated and than anybody could have expected, given the depth and complexity of the fortifications in this area. And there's increasing numbers of discussions as to why this is the case. As I said in several programs, about a week ago, Radovka, the Russian newspaper located in Smolensk region, said that there were insufficient numbers of Ukrainian troops in Toretsk, that the fortifications, that the territory that these troops needed to defend was just too extensive for the forces available, and that it was this that made it easier for the Russians to advance, and to advance so rapidly in the Toretsk sector. Well, that is an explanation, but it still begs the question of why the Ukrainians have proved up to this time so unable to stabilize the situation, which they seem to be unable to do up to now. Even Radovka, when he published that piece, said that eventually the Ukrainians would pull back, would have to be forced to pull back so far enough that their density would grow, and then the Russian advance would slow. But so far, there's no real evidence that this is happening. As I said, there's clear evidence that the Russians are now deep inside New York, this village to the south of Toretsk. It looks as if they probably can't control more than half of New York. There's another small village immediately to the west of New York, which the Russians seem to have captured. The Russians seem to have captured other places deep inside Toretsk. They're advancing, outflanking Toretsk from the north. Nobody seems to see any particular place where the Ukrainians are able to put up the kind of resistance we have seen them put up in other places and positions during this war. And it's been suggested that not only are Ukrainian troops in Toretsk few in number and perhaps inadequately equipped, but that they don't have the same level of resolve that the Ukrainian army had previously in the war. I mentioned the fact that the Russians appear to have captured a village called Pischane in the Kupiansk area. There's some reports that the Ukrainian troops there basically broke and fled. I've read reports today, very difficult to confirm, but they've appeared in Radovka, again, by the way, that a whole group of Ukrainian soldiers decided to surrender to the Russians in the Kherson area. And in order to do that, they swam across the Dnieper River in order to hand themselves in to the Russians on the east bank of the Dnieper River. So these soldiers presumably weren't even engaged in active fighting of the Russians. They'd presumably been deployed by the Ukrainians to the west bank of Kherson region. And then at the first opportunity, they fled their commanders, swam across the river, and surrendered to the Russians. Quite a dramatic piece of news if it is true, or if I have understood it correctly. So it may be that the Ukrainians are suffering major problems of morale, and that this is now becoming a problem in the Toretsk area, maybe in the Kupiansk area as well, in Pischane, possibly also in the even more important Ocheretino-Avdiivka area. Now there, we've received confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry that the Russians are indeed now in full control of the village of Oskol. And there are reports that the Russians have not only captured Sokol, but that they've actually captured another village north of Sokol, and that the fighting is still apparently going on in Yevgenivka, but the village of Yevgenivka is rapidly coming under Russian control. And there's also reports that the Russians further south have advanced through Karlovka, that more parts of Karlovka have fallen under Russian control, and that the Russians are clearing the tree lines around Karlovka and are advancing along the water barriers, which are for the moment not proving to be barriers to further Russian advances at all. But again, perhaps the most interesting thing is that there are reports of disorganized retreats by Ukrainian soldiers in this area, including from the village of Novoselivka Persha, which the Russians are now in the process of encircling. That Ukrainian troops are no longer willing or are no longer able to stand and fight and resist the Russians as they were doing earlier in the war. And this is what you might expect given the state of the Ukrainian army. I've been hearing for almost a year now that following the defeat of the Ukrainians, rather following the battles in Kherson and Kharkiv region in the autumn of 2022, and following the defeat of the Ukrainians and the fighting in Bakhmut, Ukraine had lost many of its best officers and NCOs, and the small unit leadership, the key to the battle, the key to an effective fighting force, that a lot of that had been broken, and that losses amongst junior officers and NCOs had increased still further as a result of the disastrous summer 2023 offensive that the Ukrainians launched. And I've also heard that, we've had abundant reports that the mobilized soldiers that the Ukrainians are calling up do not have the same desire to fight that the veteran soldiers who joined the Ukrainian army in the spring and summer of 2022 once had. So it looks as if the Ukrainian army is starting to suffer fundamental problems of morale and discipline, which are now affecting the course of the battle. Well, I'm not going to get into deeper discussions of what is going on the conflict lines. It remains my view that it is the fighting in Avdiivka and Ocheretino that where the big breakthrough, the Russian breakthrough, and the point of decision is going to come. With Sokol and Yevgenivka and other villages west of Ocheretino falling, the Russians are now, as I said, within artillery range of Pokrovsk and Kurakhovo and other such places, and that's going to put them in an immensely strong position to break the Ukrainian supply lines and to create the conditions, stabilize the Russian supply lines, the roads and the railways, which the Russians need to do before the final culminating battle in Donbas, the battles for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Suffice to say that even as the fighting in Ukraine goes very badly for Ukraine, we're now just 2 days away from the start of the NATO summit meeting. The United States will presumably be represented by President Biden. Who else can represent Ukraine at this summit meeting? The Americans are apparently trying to reassure the Ukrainians that some kind of bridge towards Ukraine eventually joining NATO will be offered to Ukraine at this NATO summit meeting. That is an incredibly cynical act. It continues to keep Ukraine moving along the primrose path to destruction that Professor Mearsheimer once spoke about. As I've said many times, continuing to insist that Ukraine will one day join NATO is guarantees that the war will continue and ensures that what might be, according to Simplicius the thinkers, what might be Putin's intention, total and complete and final victory over Ukraine, will indeed be the eventual way in which this war ends. But it looks as if this is what the NATO leaders at the next NATO summit meeting are going to do. They're also apparently going to supply Ukraine with more air defense missiles. Now, over the last 24 hours, the Russians apparently have destroyed a whole cluster of Ukrainian air defense systems. At least one S-300 battery, or perhaps it was more than a battery, was destroyed by the Russians in the area of the Poltava air base, which of course the Russians have attacked. But the Western powers have supplied Ukraine with more Patriot anti-aircraft missile batteries. Apparently they're going to promise to supply even more. Some of these Patriot air defense missile batteries were located in the Odessa area. They were detected by the Russians. Of course they were. And the Russians launched Iskander-M missile strikes against these Patriot air defense missile batteries. Patriot system is incapable of shooting down Iskander-M ballistic missiles, as the Ukrainians have themselves admitted, and the Russians are claiming, and they're producing pictures and films, that at least 2 Patriot air defense missile batteries have been destroyed, and a radar connected with the Patriot missile system was destroyed also. Now, again, there is a degree of denial of reality on the part of the West about one very important military fact about the war. There continues to be this constant insistence of providing Ukraine with supposedly advanced Western weapons, which actually failed to achieve the results on the battlefields that the Western advocates of delivery of these weapons say these weapons will achieve. So, huge agitation, huge pressure in the West to provide the Patriot air defense missiles. I remember at one time the United States said that it would never provide Patriot air defense missiles. Then, of course, it provided one Patriot air defense missile battery to the system to defend Kiev, but said that would be the only one it would provide. It would never provide more. And then, of course, it started to provide even more Patriot air defense missile systems. And then, having previously said that it would never provide Patriot systems, it then started to strong-arm all of its allies in Europe to provide Patriot systems. And now it's strong-arming Israel to provide all of its Patriot systems. And now it's recently announced that Ukraine is going to be prioritized over other customers in being provided with Patriot missile interceptors, even if those other customers actually had chronological priority because they placed their orders first. It's astonishing to see how, from a position of not being prepared to provide Patriot systems, the United States is now hunting around the world to find Patriot systems to send to Ukraine. And of course, the point is, these systems are not delivering. They're not doing that which they were supposed to do. The Russians have repeatedly shown that they can destroy them when they find them. They've just done it again. They're claiming that they're able to shoot down these air defense missiles when they've been launched, a fact which no one in the West seems to be discussing or commenting about. And yet, the United States, having once said that it would never provide Patriot systems, is now, as I said, scouring the world trying to find them. And it's the same with ATACMS missiles. The ATACMS missiles for months, for years, the United States said it would never provide them. Intense pressure to provide them. They were going to be a game changer. They were going to transform the war. The Russians would never be able to intercept them. They would disrupt Russian fortifications, supply lines, communication systems, logistic bases, military headquarters. Patriot missiles supplied to Ukraine, launched in staggering numbers against the Russians, shot down in staggering numbers by the Russians. Every so often, a couple of weeks ago, lots of claims that these ATACMS missiles had managed to destroy the air defenses in Crimea. One doesn't hear people any more of that any longer. People don't talk about that so much anymore. But still, no recognition in the West that the ATACMS, like the Patriots, like the HIMARS, like the M777s, like the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, like the Abrams tanks, the Bradleys, and all of those, that they're not achieving what their advocates, those who say that Ukraine should be provided them, they're not achieving the things that people said they would do. But there it is. That's probably what Zelensky is going to get at the next summit meeting. He's going to be promised more supplies of more air defense systems, of which the West has a critical shortage and which are anyway failing on the battlefields. Meanwhile, the Russians advance westwards. There's apparently an article in Politico, which I haven't seen, incidentally, which says precisely that the Russians continue remorselessly to advance. There's also, apparently the same article says that all talk of Ukrainian offensives is just pie in the sky. A couple of months ago, article in the Wall Street Journal advised against magical thinking with respect to Ukraine. As far as I can tell, magical thinking continues at exactly the same level as before. Maybe, possibly, Orban might achieve some kind of negotiation breakthrough. Perhaps, just possibly, the new administration will as well. Who's to say? But for the moment, the prospects for Ukraine look bleak, and they're getting bleaker. The Russians are advancing, and yes, Putin has set out his terms, but the Azov Brigade are telling Zelensky never to accept them, And of course, Zelensky never will. So there we are. Quite plausibly, we're going to see the end of Ukraine, and it might even be this year, if what General Alaudinov, whom I discussed yesterday, is correct. Well, that's where I finish today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop where you'll find all sorts of amazing things. We have a new product line that you can find there as well. This is additional to the Football 24 series, which of course still continues. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.